This is a 2012 Lamborghini Gallardo Super Trofeo Stradale, and it was the ultimate version of the Lamborghini Gallardo. The Gallardo lineup was tremendously complicated with a billion special editions and rare versions, but this was a special edition of a special edition. That makes it extra special. And today I'm going to review the Super Trofeo Stradale and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news! This Gallardo Super Trofeo Stradale is currently for sale, and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is a truly special car, only 150 of these on the planet. This one has low mileage and no modifications, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching the video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this special Gallardo, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Gallardo Super Trofeo Stradale. And I'm going to start with the basics and specifically where this fits in and why it's so special. So, the Gallardo came out for 2004 as Lamborghini's new entry-level model, slotting below the Murcielago. And it was a very special, very desirable car, and soon they started making special editions. The most desirable early special edition was the Superleggera, which was essentially a lightweight, high-performance version of the Gallardo. Now, in 2009, Lamborghini facelifted the Gallardo. They gave it some new styling, a new front end, some updates to the interior and technology, and before long, the Superleggera returned as the cool, high-performance Gallardo. But then the other special edition models started to flow. Within a few years, you had the Gallardo Balboni, the Performante, the Tecnica, the Squadra Corse, the Bicolore, the Tricolore, and then there was this, the Super Trofeo Stradale. Actually, there were several others too that I didn't even bother to cover, but those are the highlights. This one, though, is probably the very most special, and that's because Lamborghini based it on the Superleggera, already the rare lightweight performance model, but it was even rarer and even more lightweight. It is essentially a limited edition performance version of a performance model. And this was made even more special because it was essentially a road-going version of Lamborghini's race car at the time. The race car was the Super Trofeo. This is called the Super Trofeo Stradale, with Stradale meaning road, the road-going version of the race car. And that made it especially appealing and high performance. And yes, only 150 of these made for the entire planet. That was how short the production run is. These are very, very rare and special cars, the ultimate Gallardo. So let's talk through the quirks and features on the outside of the Super Trofeo Stradale, starting with the most obvious, the wing. This absolutely massive wing. It really is huge, and it is completely factory. This is not modified. This is how they came, with this giant wing on the back to provide more downforce and to mimic the race car. And downforce it did provide. Lamborghini says the Super Trofeo Stradale had 3 times the downforce of the standard Gallardo, thanks in part to this wing. You take a look at the wing, you'll also notice a very cool Super Trofeo Stradale logo printed on the top. I love how that logo looks, and they've used it several times throughout the car, including on the front end, which is far more aggressive than the front end design of the standard Gallardo. Once again, this looked cooler, but it also probably helped contribute to the downforce, and your air intakes were larger to get in more air to let that engine breathe. Now, on that subject, up front you have the splitter. In back you have a special diffuser that is unique to the Super Trofeo Stradale. It looks very cool, probably also improves the car's downforce, and you can see it's finished in carbon fiber. In addition to downforce, weight savings was a goal of the Super Trofeo Stradale, and so a lot of stuff inside and out with this car is carbon fiber, starting with this rear diffuser, as you can see. But they took it beyond that. The rocker panels are carbon fiber, as you can see, a nice Super Trofeo Stradale touch, and the housings for the mirrors on the outside also finished in carbon fiber to save a little bit of weight over standard painted stuff. But unquestionably, the most interesting weight savings measure on the Super Trofeo Stradale is the engine cover, which does not open with your typical latch inside the car and then you pop it open and back. Instead, there is a quick release latch mounted on the outside on the cover itself. You can see right here, you basically lift up this latch on one side and it's released, then go over to the other side, do the same thing, it's released, and then you just lift off the engine cover lid. It just comes right off. It's not hinged, there's no hydraulic, you just remove it. And you can do it from the outside of the car without having to go in and pull on a latch. So you see one of these sitting in a parking lot, you want to see what the engine looks like, well, you could just take off the engine cover if you want. And since we've removed the engine cover, let's talk about the engine. You can see it here on full display, a 5.2 liter naturally aspirated V10 that made 565 horsepower and about 400 pound-feet of torque. Now, the funny thing about this engine, it was first used in the Gallardo Superleggera, the high-performance lightweight version. It was then taken from the Superleggera and put into the Super Trofeo race car, and then after that put into this, the Super Trofeo Stradale. That allowed Lamborghini to claim that this was a racing engine when they were marketing this car back in 2012, even though technically the engine started its life in a road car, but it was indeed in a race car and then back in a road car, and that's this. Now, all of these Super Trofeo Stradale models had all-wheel drive, and the result of all the weight savings I measured is Lamborghini trimmed about 150 pounds off the standard Gallardo for a total curb weight of about 3,350 pounds. As for the engine, the big old V10, exhaust is routed out the back through these quad pipes, and as you can imagine, this thing sounds pretty cool. Take a listen to a few revs from the Super Trofeo Stradale. And next up, a few other interesting quirks on the outside of the car. One is the taillights, and specifically the taillight design, which has these cool, like Y-shaped arrows that turn on when you put on the brakes or the turn signals. They look very cool and they're very distinctive to this car. I always preferred the look of the Gallardo before the facelift in 09. I always thought it looked a little cleaner, the earlier models, but one thing they definitely got right in that facelift was these taillights, which they added, and which has always been a distinctive later Gallardo element. Interestingly, up front, the turn signals are just halogen bulbs that turn on and flash, despite the fact that this was a high-performance supercar with this cool-looking headlight housing. The turn signals were just regular old bulbs like you'd have at a Chevy Cavalier. Also interesting on the outside, two other things. One is the color. As you can see, this is red. Lamborghini calls it Rosso Mars, and it was one of only 3 colors offered in the Super Trofeo Stradale. You could also get gray or white, although I must say the vast majority I've seen, even in pictures online, have been this red. It just looked cooler. The other interesting exterior element to this car, even though it's a Lambo, it doesn't have Lambo doors. All the Gallardos had regular opening doors that, well, just open like doors, instead of scissor doors that open up like the Murcielago had, the flagship models, the Countach, the Diablo, the Aventador. This just had doors. It was a Lambo, but with normal car doors. But even though you don't get Lambo doors in this car, you still get a very cool interior, and that's specifically true of the Super Trofeo Stradale. When you open up the door, the first thing you notice is just how basic the interior door panel is. Just this giant carbon fiber piece, as you can see, and nothing else really on there. You don't have any nice leather stitched armrest or special trim. You just get a slab of carbon fiber, and the door pull has become a cloth loop in order to save weight. And even that cloth loop has carbon fiber on it. So they've really gone to a basic bare bones door panel, and that theme is continued inside the car. You start with the seats. You have these very tight, very stiff, rigid sport bucket seats, driver and passenger, finished completely in Alcantara, so you're not sliding around on the racetrack. Not that you would be anyway, because the seats are pretty narrow, the edges come up high. You're not moving around in this car. The seats are manually operated, not power, no power controls, in order to save weight, and there are holes in the backrest for you to put through a racing harness if you do plan to take this car on the track. Now, I mentioned the Alcantara seats and the carbon fiber door panel, and those are two themes that are continued all through this interior. Basically, everything is finished in one of those two materials. So, carbon fiber is everywhere. The entire center console, as you can see, is all carbon fiber, and that also continues onto the steering wheel, where you have some carbon fiber. The parking brake, you have some carbon fiber on the surround of the gauge cluster, and there's even carbon fiber on the glove box handle. They didn't want to make anything plastic, so whatever could have been plastic is carbon fiber, except for all the stuff that's Alcantara. Aside from the seats, you have Alcantara all over the dashboard. Every surface, the upper dash, the lower dash, it's everywhere, and also on the steering wheel, Alcantara and carbon fiber. They wanted to focus on racy materials, so you don't have any leather or high quality aluminum or chrome in here. It's all just lightweight, cool looking stuff. One other thing I like in this interior, the cool Super Trofeo Stradale logo was stitched into the Alcantara dashboard on the passenger side. You can see it here. They did a little logo overkill. You also have it on the door sill, as you can see, and you have it on the seats, the side of the seats, driver and passenger side, but I'm willing to forgive them for this because frankly, I like the logo. I think it's cool and I'm glad to see it in a few places. And it contributes to the specialness of this interior, which frankly is quite special. Sometimes I'll be reviewing a high-performance special edition of a car, and I will complain that it has more power and it looks cooler on the outside, but the interior is not changed at all. It doesn't really correspond to the specialness of the rest of the car. That is not the case here. This interior is just as special and magical and different as the outside of the car and its unique market position being the top of the Gallardo food chain. Now, with that said, one interesting thing you don't find in here is a numbered plaque showing just how rare this car is. I mentioned only 150 of these made for the whole world, and usually you'd see a plaque in the center console or the dashboard telling you that it's special and which number you have. Well, this car does have a plaque, but it's not in here. Instead, you can only see it by looking through the rear window. It's located here, and it shows which number this car is out of the production run of 150, and I think it's hilarious they mount it there so people can see it from the outside. In a Ferrari or Porsche, the plaque is inside the car so you can see it. In a Lamborghini, the plaque is mounted over there so other people can see it, which sort of fits with the Lamborghini mindset. But anyway, next we move on to the rest of the quirks and features in the Super Trofeo Stradale interior, and specifically the unusual and interesting controls in here. We'll start with the transmission. Now, all Super Trofeo Stradale models had an automatic. It was Lamborghini's E-Gear sequential automated manual transmission. There were some Gallardo models made with a true manual 3-pedal trans, but none of the Super Trofeo Stradale. So in the middle of the center console, you have 3 buttons. You have Sport, you have Corsa, and you have A. Sport would put the car into sport mode. Corsa was race mode for even harsher driving and quicker shifts, and A was for automatic. If you didn't want to shift gears yourself with the shift paddles on the steering column, you pressed A to automatic mode. Now, A would also put it into manual mode, so even though it says A, it really should be A/M auto or manual, but that's what that button does. Now, interestingly, the button to select reverse is nowhere in this vicinity. It is to the left of the steering wheel, hanging out all by itself over there by the driver's climate control vent, this R in a circle. That is the reverse button. It's near nothing and it's not integrated into anything. It's certainly an unusual placement. And speaking of unusual placements, how about the axle lifter, which is right here in this center console area filled with 3 blank switches, the axle lifter, and it's all centered around the power mirror control. What an exciting control that is, right in the middle of the entire center console. Also interesting, moving further up onto the center control stack, the power window switches are located here. You can see on the outer edge of this panel with toggles. The interesting part is that they operate opposite of what you'd expect. If you push up, the window goes down, and if you pull down, the window goes up, and that is Lamborghini weirdness. Next up in here, though, is some Audi weirdness. The climate controls all come from Audi, and they are frankly quite complicated. When you're operating them in normal mode, the dials will adjust the climate control temperature. But if you want to change the fan speed, you press the little fan button and then you adjust the fan speed. Then if you want to change where the air comes out, you press this little button that I guess looks like an air vent and some arrows, and then the dials adjust where the air is coming out. Now the interesting part is the fan speed and the air coming out buttons are still illuminated in red even when you're no longer controlling them with the dial. So it doesn't really make any sense. It seems like overly complicated climate controls. That was Audi, and the Germans, it just makes sense. And next up we move on to the shift paddles, which are in the usual spot behind the steering wheel. Obviously downshift on the left, upshift on the right. The cool thing here is they're mounted on the steering column. So even if you're turning the steering wheel, the paddles will always be in a predictable spot where you expect, since they don't turn with the wheel. The drawback is the placement of the paddles takes precedent over the placement of the turn signal and the wiper stalks, which are down below. So you constantly find yourself going to turn on the signal and pressing the paddle instead, which is odd. And also in this vicinity, you can see the gauge cluster here. The weird thing here is the font they chose for the gauge cluster. It looks like a 1980s or 90s video game font, and they use it on all the gauges, not just in the gauge cluster, but at the top of the dashboard as well. This font that makes it seem almost cartoonish and funny, as opposed to a serious performance race car for the road. One other thing I like in Lamborghini gauges from this era, they didn't bother to translate the Italian. So in the fuel gauge, for instance, it doesn't say fuel, it says benzina, which is the Italian word. In the oil gauges, it says olio. Battery, it says batteria. They didn't make the change to other languages, I guess, because they figure Italian is a beautiful, cool language, and you will learn and adapt. And so we do. This is something that Hyundai or Kia could not get away with. Now, next up, also worth pointing out in this interior, is the infotainment screen. It's actually a fairly decent sized screen for a car from this era, but unfortunately, it is not a touch screen, and so operation is pretty cumbersome. You got to deal with this dial over on the right side and these buttons that surround the dial to select what it is you want to see and where you want to go to. You also have a row of buttons below the screen that can also help navigate throughout the screen and the system, but you're mostly going to be using this for media and music, since navigation would be very clunky and cumbersome in here. Now, interestingly, in the gauge cluster, you have a full color screen, which was pretty advanced for 2012, but it is in there. And when you turn on the car, it shows your basics, like your time, your odometer, that sort of thing. There's a little button hidden at the end of the windshield wiper stalk. It's a switch that goes up, down, and when you press it, it changes one line in this gauge cluster screen to show various different things, like your trip odometer, your average fuel economy, your miles till empty, that sort of thing. You can display whatever you want to see by tapping this button at the end of the wiper stalk. The thing I like the most, though, about this full-colored center gauge screen comes from this button here mounted next to the gauges. It says check, and when you press it, this gauge screen cycles through all of the possible warning lights your car could have. They show them all, basically just greeting you, saying, hello, I'm a possible warning light, but don't worry, you're checking me and I'm all good. And it scrolls through them all, and at the end it lets you know everything is okay. And finally, we move on to the front trunk in the Super Trofeo Stradale. To get under here, pretty simple. There's a latch in the driver's footwell. You pull it, then you come up here and open up another latch, and you're in. And you can see this cargo compartment is actually decently sized. There's a large panel that cuts it in half, that bisects it, and they do that so they can get around the regulation that requires them to have an inside release in case you kidnap someone. By putting this panel here, no part of of this compartment is large enough, according to the government, for you to kidnap someone so they don't need the interior release, which saves them some money, I guess. But that's why it's split into two. Now, the other interesting thing in here, you can see there are two Lamborghini cases. The one over on the left, this is your fix-a-flat. To get a flat tire, there's no full-size spare in this car, obviously, but you open this up and you can fix your flat by the roadside for a temporary drive to a service. Over on the other side, this one is even better, perfectly contoured to fit in this space in the trunk. You open it up and it's your tool kit for you to perform roadside repairs, and it even comes with a pair of Lamborghini branded gloves so you don't get your hands dirty while you're fixing whatever it is on the side of the road that you can address with the toolkit. All right, driving the Super Trofeo Stradale, and I gotta say, I've spent a little bit of time in this car. The first thing you notice, it is rough in here. This is the road-going version of the race car. I kind of made fun of them for that earlier, like, oh, they say that even though this engine was in a road car first. Well, that may be true, but man, the ride is harsh. I mean, this thing, and there's not a lot of sound deadening, and this thing feels just like incredibly focused. Hard-edged, rigid, tight, and focused. Every bump you feel, you hear a lot from the engine. Oh, man, this thing beats you up. It's harsh. It's harsh in a wonderful way, though. Like, if you've made the decision to buy this, you've passed up a lot of other Gallardos to get like the most focused, most special one for a reason. Oh, but bumps. Now, performance, of course, is also fantastic. It's a lot of power from a V10. Oh, it goes so hard. It just goes so hard. Oh, listen to that, those downshifts. It sounds good, it goes hard, it feels good. This is exactly what you want. Oh, woo! This is exactly what you want from a supercar, in my opinion. Like, I think that the hardest edged, most focused versions of these cars are generally the best, because if I chose not to drive my Mercedes that day, or whatever it is that people of these cars own, I want that. Like, I want the feel that this car provides. I want to feel that, and that's exactly what you get here. And man, it is ferocious the way this car drives. Just angry and mean and straight up ferocious. Now, a couple of other things worth pointing out. Number one, steering is excellent. It is not as good as the Huracan. The Huracan is just this incredible steering tightness and precision and immediacy that this car doesn't quite have. But there's a little bit more of an old school analog feel to the steering here. It feels a little bit more weighty, like you're really affecting it a little bit more when you turn the wheel. It's a little less video game. The really important thing to talk about with this car is the transmission, because ultimately this is E-gear. This is not dual clutch. That came with the Huracan in 14. And it's not a stick. And I gotta say, E-gear isn't so bad. I've really started to come around on sequential manual, automated manual transmissions, because they feel mechanical in a wonderful old school way. I hated these transmissions in period and for many years thereafter, but having driven a bunch recently, the Ferrari 612, Lamborghini Murcielago, like, I've started to realize, like, there's a mechanical feel here, the clunk of the shift, that is kind of neat, actually. And so you let off, you feel it, you get back on, and it's a fairly quick shift, it's fairly smooth, and it's more mechanical than at least than a dual clutch. Obviously, a dual clutch is faster, it's better in most ways, but I don't hate these sequential manuals as much as I once did. And this is a pretty refined version in the sense that it is pretty quick shifting and is relatively smooth. Overall, I gotta say, I'm impressed with this car. I love what it is, and I love what it represents, which is like a real hardcore performance car, and kind of the pinnacle of the Gallardo range. Gallardo was a very cool car. Any V10 looked cool, you know, becoming kind of an old school Lamborghini. It was neat, it was special, and this is, to my mind, the most special of them. The high performance version of the high performance version, low production, and just like no compromise. You're sitting in this thing, your teeth are chattering, you can't think about anything other than how uncomfortable you are. Like, this is the one you want if you want to be a serious hardcore enthusiast. All the GT3 RS guys think they're cool, they should get in this thing. This thing is hardcore. And as a result, I just absolutely love it. I think it's incredibly cool. It's a fun, fast, exciting car, great engine, exciting transmission, even though it's not like the quickest or the most fun. There's just a lot to like here. This is a the Gallardo was a cool car, and this is a very special version. And so that's the 2012 Lamborghini Gallardo Super Trofeo Stradale. I've always loved the Gallardo. It's very cool, and this really is the ultimate version, a very special car, even if you do have to give everyone a 10-minute explanation about where it fits in with all the other Gallardo special editions. It's really cool, and you can get this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this Gallardo a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 62 out of 100, which puts the Gallardo Super Trofeo Stradale here against some similar cars. This is a reasonably strong showing given its age, beating out some cool stuff like the original Murcielago and the Ferrari 360 Challenge Stradale. And I was quite impressed generally with the Super Trofeo Stradale. It's loud, it's rare, it's shockingly fun to drive, the interior is pretty nice, and the exterior is wonderfully distinctive compared to other Gallardo models, even the myriad of special editions. The real drawback is the ride quality, which is tremendously punishing even among this caliber of high-performance car. This really does feel like a race car for road use.